My cruise ship captain laughed at a Category 4 hurricane on the radar and threatened to have me thrown off at the next port if I didn't get back to juggling or whatever the hell I did. When Sophia screamed that people were going to die, he looked her dead in the eye and said, "Little girl, I've been captain longer than you've been alive." I didn't say a word. That was 14 months ago. Yesterday, he was sentenced to 850 consecutive life terms. What's the worst thing you've seen happen because of someone's huge ego? I was working as an entertainer on this cruise ship when the worst storm I'd ever seen came out of nowhere. My girlfriend Sophia and I did this magic show together in the main theater, and right in the middle of our afternoon performance, the ship started rocking so hard that props were sliding off the stage. The audience was grabbing their seats while these monster waves slammed against the windows, but Captain Torres came on the intercom with his usual sing-songy voice, saying everything was perfectly fine and to enjoy their evening. Between shows, ran up to the bridge to see what was really happening, and there was Torres standing with his arms crossed, staring at a weather radar that was completely red, while his first officer begged him to evacuate everyone to the lifeboats. The first officer kept saying this was a Category 4 hurricane, and we needed to act now, but Torres actually laughed at him. He said he'd been sailing for 30 years and wasn't about to ruin his perfect safety record over some rough water that would pass in an hour. When I tried to tell him the theater was flooding, he got in my face and said if I didn't get back to juggling or whatever the hell I did, he'd throw me off at the next port and make sure I never worked another cruise again. The next hour turned into complete chaos as the storm got worse and worse. The pools on the upper deck turned into waterfalls, dumping water everywhere, and the elevators stopped working with people trapped inside them. The glass ceiling in the main atrium exploded, and the ocean started pouring in like someone opened a massive drain above us. Sophia found me helping this older woman out of the flooded casino and told me the crew quarters were already underwater with people trapped behind doors that wouldn't open because of the water pressure. We ran back to the bridge together and found Captain Torres on the phone with corporate, telling them everything was under control while water was literally cascading down the stairs behind him. Sophia screamed at him that people were going to die if he didn't call for evacuation right now. Torres looked at her with this cold expression and said, "Little girl, I've been captain longer than you've been alive, so get back to work before I have security escort you to the brig." The ship suddenly tilted so far that everyone slid into the wall, but Torres just grabbed a railing and kept insisting we were absolutely fine, and anyone who said otherwise was spreading panic. That's when I decided his ego wasn't worth hundreds of lives. I told Sophia to start getting passengers to the lifeboats while I ran to the emergency supply room and kicked the door until the lock broke. Inside were the override keys that could trigger evacuation alarms without the captain's approval, and I grabbed all of them plus flares and emergency whistles. I started on deck 12 and worked my way down, using the keys to set off alarms and screaming at everyone to get to their muster stations immediately. Sophia took half the supplies and went the opposite direction, and within minutes we had hundreds of passengers moving toward the lifeboats while crew members finally stopped waiting for permission and started launching them. The ship was leaning so bad that you had to walk on the walls, and through the windows I could see these tiny orange lifeboats disappearing into waves that looked like mountains. Captain Torres came on the intercom shrieking about unauthorized evacuation and court-martial and how he'd personally destroy everyone's career, but his voice cut out when this horrible metal screaming sound ripped through the entire ship. The hull had cracked open and water was flooding in so fast that entire stairwells became waterfalls. I helped launch 5 lifeboats from my side while the ship kept tilting worse and worse, and through the bridge windows I could see Captain Torres pulling desperately at his door that had jammed shut when the frame bent. He was pounding on the glass, screaming for help with this look of absolute terror, finally understanding what his arrogance had caused, but nobody could reach him because the bridge was already cut off by flooding. The security officer who'd been trying to enforce Torres's insane orders was now using an axe on the bridge door, but the captain who doomed us all by refusing to evacuate was going to go down with his ship whether he wanted to or not. The bow started rising out of the water while the stern sank deeper, and that's when I realized I hadn't seen Sophia in 20 minutes. I screamed her name over and over while people shoved past me toward the last boats, but she wasn't answering her radio, and she wasn't at any of the muster stations. The deck was almost vertical now, and the emergency lights were failing one by one, and I knew she was somewhere in that darkness, maybe hurt, maybe trapped, maybe trying to save someone because she never could leave anyone behind. The last lifeboat was dropping, and the crew member holding it screamed at me to jump now or die, and all I could think was that Sophia was still somewhere on this sinking ship, and I had no idea if she was even alive. My hands let go of the cable, and I dropped straight into the black water that hit me like frozen concrete. The impact drove me down so deep, my ears popped, and everything went completely dark while pieces of the ship crashed into the water around me. My life vest yanked me back up, but another wave slammed down and spun me around until I couldn't tell which way was up. Something metal scraped past my leg, and I broke the surface, gasping while the ship's lights tilted sideways above me like a skyscraper falling over. I screamed Sophia's name, but the wind ripped it away, and a deck chair smashed into the water inches from my head. Orange flares shot from different parts of the ship, while tiny lifeboats rose and disappeared on waves bigger than buildings. A searchlight swept across me, and hands grabbed my vest and pulled me over the side of a lifeboat where 20 people sat pressed together shaking. Dr. Winters was doing chest compressions on an old man whose head was bleeding while his wife held his hand crying. I grabbed her shoulder asking if she'd seen Sophia, but she just shook her head and kept pumping the man's chest. Through the plastic window, I watched the ship's stern rise completely out of the water with the propellers still spinning in the air. The hull made this deep groaning sound like metal screaming, and the bridge windows exploded outward in a spray of glass and water. I knew Torres was trapped in there as water filled the compartment, but there was nothing anyone could do now. People around me started calling out names of missing family members while our our boat climbed waves so tall we couldn't see past them. The radio kept crackling with other boats calling for help, saying they had injured people or too many passengers or people still floating in the water. 2 hours passed with us just rising and falling in the darkness when suddenly the ship split in half with a sound like thunder. The bow section slid under in seconds, while the stern stayed vertical for maybe 10 more seconds before following it down. Our entire floating city disappeared in less than 2 minutes, leaving nothing but darkness and debris everywhere. Dawn finally came with helicopters appearing overhead and their spotlights showing mattresses and suitcases and pieces of furniture floating for miles. I counted 12 lifeboats when there should have been 20 while helping wave down a Coast Guard cutter that pulled alongside us. They wrapped us in these silver blankets on the deck where hundreds of other survivors sat in groups crying or staring at nothing. I went person to person showing them Sophia's picture on my phone that barely worked after being soaked. Each one shook their head or was crying too hard to look while listing their own missing people. Dr. Winters found me and sat down with this look on her face that made my stomach drop. She said she was in the crew area helping people evacuate when the flooding started, and she saw Sophia at Lifeboat Station 7 on the port side. That was the section that went under first when the hull cracked, and she was directing passengers into boats instead of getting in one herself. I just stared at her, unable to understand that Sophia died saving strangers she didn't even know. The next day at the emergency shelter in Miami, these Red Cross people took my statement while the news showed underwater footage of the wreck. They said 847 people got rescued, but over 400 were still missing, including most of the bridge officers. Captain Torres's body was found still on the bridge with his hands on the door that never opened. I sat there in the shelter staring at the TV when this woman with her arm in a sling walked up to me, and I recognized her as Lisa Park from the ship. She sat down next to me and started crying while she told me she was with Sophia at Station 7 when the whole deck flooded in seconds. She said Sophia saw this old couple who couldn't walk and went back for them, pushing Lisa toward the ladder and telling her to launch the boat without her. Lisa kept saying she tried to wait, but the water came so fast and Sophia just disappeared into it while helping those people to the stairs. I couldn't even respond because my hands were shaking so bad I had to call Sophia's parents in Arizona and tell them their daughter was missing. Her mom answered on the second ring all cheerful, asking if we were having fun on the cruise, and when I told her what happened, she screamed so loud everyone in the shelter turned to look at me. Her dad got on the phone asking if I was absolutely sure. Maybe she was on another rescue ship, maybe the lists were wrong, but I had to tell him no, she was gone. I'm trying to understand how someone's brain works when they're that far in denial. Torres kept insisting everything was fine, even when water was pouring in everywhere. What makes a person hold onto their pride so hard they can't see reality? The way Sophia. I couldn't sleep that night or the next one, and by the third day I was walking Miami Beach at 3 in the morning watching the Coast Guard helicopters still searching the water. Every piece of wood or trash that floated by made my heart jump, thinking maybe somehow it was a person. Maybe it was her, even though I knew that was impossible after 3 days in the ocean. The next morning, these people in suits showed up at the shelter with briefcases full of papers and started pulling families aside, offering them $50,000 checks if they'd sign papers saying they wouldn't sue the cruise line. I watched exhausted parents with kids sign those papers while lawyers walked around handing out business cards and promising they could get millions in court instead. The TV in the corner was playing CNN, and suddenly there was James Mitchell, the first officer, in a hospital bed with a neck brace around his neck. He was telling the reporter how Captain Torres ignored every single evacuation recommendation and threatened to fire anyone who disagreed with him about the weather. Mitchell said he begged Torres 14 times to evacuate, and Torres laughed at him and called him a coward who didn't deserve to wear a uniform. Within an hour, the interview was everywhere online, with hashtag Torres New trending and people posting about how the captain murdered 400 people with his ego. On day 5, I met up with the other entertainers from the ship at this Denny's in downtown Miami, and we all shared what we saw during the sinking. The ship's comedian started crying when he told us Torres had been drinking in his cabin earlier that day, celebrating his upcoming retirement after what he kept calling his perfect career with 0 accidents. That's when Victor Petrov messaged me on Facebook with screenshots from the engine room computer showing Torres got severe weather warnings 6 hours before the storm hit. The logs showed Torres marked every single warning as reviewed with no action needed, and even wrote notes calling the weather service alarmist idiots. Victor had saved all the data to his personal phone right before evacuating because he knew someone would try to cover this up. 2 days later, I got called to the FBI field office where 2 agents questioned me for 3 hours about the unauthorized evacuation. They kept saying I could face charges for inciting panic and theft of emergency equipment, which made me laugh right in their faces. I asked them if they seriously planned to charge me for saving lives while Torres committed mass murder through his negligence, and they just stared at me with these blank expressions. When Sophia's parents arrived in Miami, I took them to the beach where debris from the ship was still washing up every day. Her mom picked up every single piece of paper she found, hoping to find something of Sophia's, while her dad just stood there staring at the water. We found a life ring with the ship's name on it, a waterlogged menu from the main dining room, and this little kid's teddy bear all covered in seaweed. The next morning, every news channel started playing security footage that Navy divers recovered from the ship's black box. The footage showed Captain Torres physically pushing Mitchell away from the evacuation alarm while these massive waves crashed over the bridge windows. You could see Torres screaming at Mitchell and pointing at the door while the ship tilted more and more. The footage also caught me and Sophia running in opposite directions with the emergency keys, proving we both acted independently to save lives when the captain refused to. The news anchors kept replaying the part where Torres shoved Mitchell into the wall, and you could see the exact moment a wave hit that cracked the bridge window. 2 weeks later, I sat in my hotel room that victim services was paying for, scrolling through videos on my phone phone of Sophia doing our bullet catch trick. She smiled and took her bow after catching the marked bullet between her teeth, and watching her felt like seeing someone who died years ago instead of just weeks. The phone rang with news that Congress was launching a full investigation into the disaster, and all surviving crew members would have to testify about what really happened. I got my subpoena the next morning while standing in the Miami morgue looking at bodies pulled from the water, checking each face to see if it was Sophia, but none of them were her. The medical examiner kept apologizing for making me look at so many bodies, but I had to know if they found her. Dr. Winters called me that afternoon to say a documentary crew wanted to film our stories about the sinking. She said the cruise line was already telling reporters that Captain Torres died a hero who went down with his ship, and she thought people needed to hear what actually happened. I told her I'd think about it, but honestly couldn't focus on anything except finding Sophia. 3 weeks after the sinking, the Coast Guard returned her suitcase they'd pulled from the debris field, and when I opened it, her stage costume was still damp and smelled like salt water. I reached into the hidden pocket where I'd put the engagement ring I bought in Miami, planning to propose during our final bow on the last night of the cruise. The ring was still there in its little velvet box, and she never even knew it existed because I wanted to surprise her. I sat on the hotel bed holding that ring and crying harder than I'd cried since the ship went down. Alan Briggs called me the next day and asked if we could meet at a coffee shop near the hotel. He showed up looking like he hadn't slept in weeks and pulled out his phone to show me something. He had body camera footage from that night showing Captain Torres screaming at Mitchell while water poured through the bridge windows. The cruise line's lawyers told him not to share the video with anyone, but Briggs said he couldn't live with himself if people believed Torres was some kind of hero. The footage showed Torres shoving Mitchell into the wall and ordering security to restrain him when Mitchell tried to trigger the evacuation alarm. You could hear Torres saying the storm would pass, and anyone who disagreed was fired, even as the ship tilted so bad that equipment was sliding across the bridge. Briggs gave me a copy of the video on a flash drive and said to use it however I needed to. Week 4 came with a congressional hearing in Washington, and I sat in that wood-paneled room telling them everything about Torres, threatening to end my career if I didn't get back to juggling. The cruise line's lawyers kept objecting and saying I was speculating, but I talked over them and named every single person I saw Torres put in danger. I told them about Mitchell begging Torres to evacuate, about the captain laughing at his first officer's concerns, about Torres calling corporate to lie while people drowned below decks. During a break, this lawyer named David Kim came up to me in the hallway and said he represented 17 families whose relatives were still missing. Kim showed me documents proving the cruise line covered up 3 previous safety violations involving Torres, including one where he sailed through a tropical storm against Port Authority orders. He said Torres had a pattern of ignoring safety warnings to maintain his schedule, and the company knew but kept promoting him because he saved them money by never canceling cruises. The Coast Guard presented their computer models the next day, showing the ship would have survived if we'd started evacuating when Mitchell first said to. Their expert testified that the delay caused by Torres meant lifeboats launched in deadly conditions and approximately 300 people died who could have lived if we'd evacuated an hour earlier. The cruise line's lawyers tried to argue the storm was unpredictable, but the Coast Guard had weather data showing clear warnings that Torres ignored. That night, Mitchell and I went to the hotel bar and drank until we couldn't see straight. Mitchell told me he actually grabbed Torres and tried to physically pull him away from the ship's controls, but Torres ordered Briggs to restrain him. Briggs locked Mitchell in a storage cabin that later flooded, and Mitchell only escaped because a crew member heard him pounding on the door and let him out. Mitchell kept saying he should have done more, should have knocked Torres out, should have taken control of the ship by force. I told him we both did what we could, but the truth was, I felt the same guilt about not saving more people. Week 5 brought news that made me want to punch through a wall. They found Torres's body still on the bridge, his hands frozen around the ship's wheel like he died trying to steer through the storm. The cruise line immediately started calling him a hero captain who stayed with his ship to the very end, refusing to abandon his post even as death approached. They put out press releases about his decades of service and his dedication to maritime tradition, completely ignoring that he caused the whole disaster by refusing to evacuate when he had the chance. 3 weeks later, I tried to get back to normal life and went to the mall for new clothes since everything I owned went down with the ship. The place was packed with families shopping for summer vacation stuff, and right in the center court was this huge cruise display with pictures of smiling people on perfect blue water. My chest got tight and my hands started shaking as I walked past travel agencies with posters of ships just like ours. I made it to the food court, but the noise of hundreds of people talking and laughing hit me like those screams from the flooding hallways. My legs gave out and I dropped to my knees gasping for air while some teenager asked if I needed an ambulance. I crawled to the bathroom and locked myself in a stall until I could breathe again. Victor called me that afternoon with something he'd found in the engine room data they recovered. He showed me computer records proving Torres manually overrode the automatic stabilizers 16 times as the storm got worse. The way Torres kept pushing Mitchell away from that alarm button makes me wonder what was going through his mind. Did he really believe the storm would pass, or was he too scared to admit he was wrong? The ship's systems kept trying to adjust our angle to handle the waves better, but Torres kept forcing us straight into the hurricane because changing course would add 6 hours to the schedule. Victor had timestamp proof that Torres was literally fighting the ship's safety systems to maintain his precious on-time record. 2 days later, Sophia's parents called from Arizona asking me to speak at her memorial service. Her mom was crying so hard she could barely talk, but her dad got on and said they needed closure and wanted me there since I was the last person who saw her. I told them I couldn't leave Miami while the Coast Guard was still searching, and her dad's voice turned cold. He said I was being selfish, holding on to false hope, and that I needed to accept Sophia was gone so her family could grieve properly. The call ended with him yelling that I was making everything worse by refusing to let her go. Week 6 came and Dr. Winters reached out saying she'd started a support group for survivors. I didn't want to go, but she said it might help to talk to others who understood what we went through. The meeting was in this church basement, and there were maybe 20 people sitting in a circle. This woman named Carol started talking about her twin daughters who were 12 years old. She said water started coming under their cabin door, and she tried to get them out, but the pressure jammed it shut. She could hear them screaming for her on the other side while the water rose, and she kept pulling at the handle until her hands were bleeding. She passed out from hypothermia and woke up in a lifeboat knowing her girls drowned alone in that room. Nobody said anything for a long time after that. Sunday night, I was watching TV in my hotel when 60 Minutes came on with an exclusive interview with the cruise line CEO. This guy in a $1,000 suit sat there saying the company followed all safety protocols and that Captain Torres was a decorated officer who made the best decisions possible in an unprecedented weather event. He actually said Torres died a hero trying to save his ship and that any suggestion of negligence was just lawyers trying to profit from tragedy. I threw the remote so hard it went through the window and shattered glass all over the parking lot. The hotel manager kicked me out that night and said he'd call the cops if I came back. My lawyer David called me to his office the next morning, saying his investigator Kim had found something important. She spread out printed emails showing the cruise line knew about Torres's drinking problem for years. 3 different passengers had filed complaints about him being dismissive about safety concerns, and 1 crew member reported seeing him drunk during emergency drills. The company not only ignored all of it, but actually promoted him because his on-time departure record improved their quarterly earnings by 2%. Kim had emails where executives discussed how Torres's aggressive scheduling saved them millions, even though they knew he was taking risks. I moved into this cheap motel near the port and spent my nights staring at ocean current maps on my laptop. I calculated drift patterns based on where Sophia was last seen and contacted fishing boat captains asking them to watch for anything. I paid 2 dive companies my entire savings to search specific coordinates, but they only found pieces of deck chairs and life vests. Every morning I'd wake up thinking maybe today someone would find her, and every night I'd fall asleep knowing they hadn't. Lisa came to see me during week 7 looking exhausted and thin. She sat on my bed and said she kept having the same nightmare where Sophia was standing in floodwater, asking why Lisa left her behind. I told her Sophia pushed her to that ladder knowing exactly what would happen and that she'd never blame Lisa for surviving. Lisa said she knew that logically, but couldn't stop seeing Sophia's face every time she closed her eyes. We sat there for a while not talking, because what was there to say about the person we both couldn't save? The FBI held a press conference announcing their investigation was complete. They said no criminal charges would be filed against me and that my unauthorized evacuation saved hundreds of lives. But in the same breath, they announced no charges against cruise line executives either, because there wasn't sufficient evidence of criminal negligence despite Torres's documented actions. The agent actually stood there saying that bad judgment during a crisis wasn't the same as criminal intent. I turned off the TV and punched a hole in the motel wall. Mitchell called me that night with news that made everything worse. Briggs had been found dead in his Miami apartment from an apparent suicide, with a note saying he couldn't live with following Torres's orders for even those few minutes before helping with evacuation. He wrote that every person who died after he initially tried to stop the evacuation was his fault, and he saw their faces every time he tried to sleep. 3 weeks later, my phone buzzed with an email from an address I didn't recognize, but the subject line just said, "From Briggs, watch this," and my hands started shaking as I opened the attachment. The video file took forever to download on the motel's terrible Wi-Fi, but when it finally played, I saw everything through Briggs's body camera from that night. The footage showed Torres grabbing Mitchell by the collar and slamming him against the bridge console while screaming about his perfect 30-year record being more important than some weather system that would pass. Mitchell tried to push him off, but Torres actually punched him in the stomach before ordering Briggs to taser a young crew member who was reaching for the evacuation alarm. The kid dropped to the floor twitching while Torres stood over him, saying anyone else who tried to cause panic would get the same treatment. I watched it 5 times, making sure I was seeing what I thought I was seeing, before calling Kim, who picked up on the first ring. She drove to my motel at 2 in the morning and watched the footage on my laptop with her mouth hanging open. She said this changed everything, but warned me that Briggs had signed an NDA when he left the company, so they'd claim the footage was stolen property. We needed to find a way to get it out there without the cruise line burying it in legal challenges that could take years to resolve. The next morning, Dr. Winters called asking if we could meet at the coffee shop near the Survivor Center, and when I got there, she looked like she hadn't slept in days. She told me a hospital in Seattle had offered her a position running their trauma unit with triple her old salary, but she felt like taking it would be abandoning everyone who still needed help. Her voice cracked when she admitted she kept seeing the faces of people she couldn't save on the ship and wondering if she picked the wrong ones to help first when the flooding started. I told her she saved dozens of lives and deserved to move on, but she just stared at her coffee saying, "Survivor's guilt doesn't care about logic." 2 days later, I got a text from Sophia's mom saying they were holding her memorial service that weekend, but understood if I couldn't make it to California, so they'd set up a live stream for anyone who wanted to watch. I sat in my motel room watching on my phone as her sister Maria stood at the podium, talking about how Sophia had always been the one who put others first, even as a little kid. Maria told this story about Halloween when they were 8 and 10, and Sophia gave away half her candy to kids whose parents couldn't afford costumes, so they couldn't go trick-or-treating. Her voice broke when she said Sophia died the same way she lived, thinking about everyone else before herself. I turned off the stream when they started showing photos of her as a baby, because I couldn't handle seeing her grow up knowing how it ended. That afternoon, a woman I'd never seen before walked up to me at the Survivor Center and said she needed to tell me something about Sophia. She explained she'd been trapped in the crew quarters when the water started rising and the electronic locks failed, but then Sophia appeared with a fire axe she'd pulled off the wall. Sophia was soaking wet and bleeding from a cut on her forehead, but she smashed through doors door after door, pulling people out and pushing them toward the stairs. The woman said Sophia had already gotten everyone out of their section when they heard someone screaming from a room at the end of the hallway that was already half underwater. She watched Sophia take a deep breath and run back toward that room just as the hull made this horrible cracking sound and the lights went out. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Kim called the next week saying she was ready to file the civil suit and needed me at the federal courthouse in Miami to sign some papers as a witness. The courthouse was this massive building with metal detectors and guards everywhere, and Kim met me in the lobby with a stack of documents 3 inches thick. She'd gotten 147 families to join the suit and was using the congressional testimony plus the Coast Guard analysis showing Torres ignored 17 separate weather warnings. While we were there, a reporter recognized Kim and asked about the case, and she told them the cruise line's own records would prove criminal negligence. The story hit the news that night, and by morning, the cruise line's stock had dropped 40%, with investors dumping shares as fast as they could sell them. I couldn't stay in that motel anymore, so I found a studio apartment in Miami Beach for $800 a month, which was all I could afford with my savings running out. The apartment was basically a single room with a hot plate and a mattress on the floor, but it had a view of the ocean from the window. I got a job at a beach bar serving drinks to tourists who had no idea who I was or what had happened to me 2 months ago. Wait, how did Briggs manage to record all that with his body camera without Torres noticing? The way Torres was hitting Mitchell and ordering people to be tasered, did the captain really think nobody would ever see this footage? I chose that job specifically because I could see the ocean while I worked, and some stupid part of me kept expecting to see Sophia walking out of the waves like the whole thing had been a nightmare. The documentary crew showed up at the bar one afternoon with their cameras and release forms, saying they wanted to interview me for their film about the disaster. I agreed, but only if they'd let me talk about Sophia and not just about Torres and the sinking. They filmed me for 3 hours while I showed them videos on my phone of our magic shows and told them about how she'd practice card tricks until her fingers were sore. I showed them footage of her doing this trick where she'd make someone's wedding ring disappear, then reappear in a sealed envelope, and the look of joy on her face when the audience gasped. I told them about how she'd stay after every show to take photos with kids and always let them try on her sequined jacket. They asked if I had any final thoughts, and I said, Sofia Rodriguez saved at least 20 people that night and deserved to be remembered as a hero, not just victim number 89 on some list. 2 days later, Kim called with bad news that made everything worse. The cruise line's insurance company was refusing to pay any claims, saying Torres's actions constituted intentional misconduct, which wasn't covered under their policy. This meant all the families who'd lost someone and all the survivors with medical bills and trauma were going to have to wait years while lawyers fought about contract language and coverage exclusions. Kim said she'd keep fighting but warned me this could take a decade to resolve, and even then the cruise line might declare bankruptcy to avoid paying. Mitchell showed up at my apartment that night looking like he'd aged 10 years in 2 months. He sat on my floor drinking beer and told me he'd been diagnosed with PTSD and couldn't even look at the ocean without having panic attacks. He was planning to testify in the civil suit, but admitted he felt like a coward for not physically fighting Torres when he had the chance. I reminded him there were 3 security guards on the bridge who would have stopped him, but Mitchell just kept saying he should have tried harder to save everyone. About a week later, I got a package with no return address sitting outside my door when I came back from the grocery store. Inside was a USB drive wrapped in bubble wrap with a sticky note that just said, "People need to know." I plugged it into my laptop and found hundreds of files from Torres's personal cabin computer, including his private logs from the day of the storm. The entries made my stomach turn as I read Torres writing about how the weather reports showed a Category 4 hurricane, but he wasn't going to let some wind and rain force him off schedule. He actually wrote that lesser captains would flee, but he wasn't lesser, and his exceptional seamanship would handle whatever nature threw at him. I called Kim immediately, and she came over within 20 minutes to look at the files herself. She scrolled through page after page of Torres, bragging about how he'd navigated through storms that would have sent other captains running to port. When she got to the part where he wrote about the crew being too soft and needing to toughen up, she had to step away from the computer. She warned me that sharing these logs publicly could hurt our case if we couldn't prove they were real, since the cruise line would claim they were fake. We needed someone from inside the company to verify them, but no current employee would risk their job to help survivors. 3 weeks passed while Kim tried to find someone who could authenticate the logs without the cruise line finding out. The 3-month anniversary of the sinking came up, and Dr. Winters organized a dinner at this Italian place for all the survivors in the area. 23 of us showed up, and we pushed tables together in the back room, while other diners had no idea they were eating next to people who'd survived one of the worst maritime disasters in decades. We raised our glasses to the missing, and people started sharing stories about the ones who didn't make it. Someone talked about how Sophia used to organize talent shows for the crew members and always made sure the shyest people got their moment in the spotlight. Another person remembered her sneaking extra desserts to the housekeeping staff who worked late shifts. Dr. Winters mentioned how Sophia gave her a compass during the evacuation, telling her not to lose her way, and I had to excuse myself to the bathroom because I knew that compass was a prop from our act that she always kept for luck. The next morning I couldn't sleep, so I went to the beach at sunrise with our old magic kit. I set up on the sand and started going through our bullet catch routine by myself while the waves crashed nearby. I loaded the blank into the gun and went through all the motions of catching it in my teeth, even though there was no one there to fire it. A jogger stopped to watch me moving around with the gun and the silk scarves, looking confused at this guy doing magic tricks alone at dawn. She probably thought I was crazy as I went through the whole routine talking to empty air where Sophia should have been standing. I packed up the kit and walked back to my car just as my phone rang with Kim saying she'd found someone. The cruise line's former head of safety had been fired 2 weeks earlier and was willing to authenticate Torres's logs in exchange for immunity in in the civil suit. We met him at a Starbucks, where he looked at the files on my laptop and confirmed they matched the format and encryption signatures of the captain's personal system. He told us the company knew Torres was unstable, but kept him because his aggressive scheduling increased profits by $2 million annually. They'd received complaints from crew members about his behavior, but corporate always sided with him because he made them money. The judge in our civil case ordered the cruise line to release all internal communications about Torres and safety protocols within 30 days. The company's lawyers immediately appealed, claiming trade secrets, but the judge threatened them with criminal contempt charges if they didn't comply. While we waited for those documents, I got a call from a group of crew members who were planning their own lawsuit for unsafe working conditions. We met at a community center where 15 former employees described how Torres regularly ignored international maritime labor laws. They told me he forced crews to work through mandatory rest periods and threatened deportation for anyone who complained. One guy from the Philippines said Torres made him work 36 hours straight during a previous storm, and when he asked for a break, Torres said he'd make sure he never worked on another ship again. Dr. Winters came by my apartment to tell me she was taking the Seattle position, but would fly back for any trial testimony we needed. She handed me a small box, and inside was the compass Sophia had given her during the evacuation. She said she thought I should have it since it meant something special, and she didn't know it was actually a prop from our magic act that Sophia always carried for good luck. I started teaching magic to kids at the community center on Saturday mornings just to have something to do with my hands. These 8 and 9-year-olds would lose their minds over simple card tricks, and it felt good to see that kind of joy again. One boy reminded me of myself at that age, before I knew that making people disappear on stage was so much easier than keeping them from disappearing in real life. Lisa called me one afternoon, completely panicked, because she was being followed by private investigators hired by the cruise line. They'd been photographing her at bars and restaurants, trying to make it look like she was some kind of alcoholic whose testimony couldn't be trusted. She'd noticed the same car outside her apartment for 3 days, and when she confronted the driver, he sped off, but not before she got a picture of his license plate. I drove straight to Lisa's apartment building after she sent me the photo, and found the same car parked across the street with a guy inside pretending to read a newspaper. I walked up and knocked on his window while recording on my phone, and when he rolled it down, I asked him point blank who was paying him to follow Lisa. He tried to deny it at first, but I showed him the photo Lisa took and told him I knew he was working for the cruise line, and that's when his whole attitude changed. He actually laughed and said we could record whatever we wanted because the cruise line had unlimited resources, while all we had were sob stories nobody cared about. The guy drove off, but not before warning me that they'd been watching all of us and knew everything about our lives, our debts, our problems, anything they could use to make us look unreliable in court. That same night, Victor called me from a burner phone saying he'd gone into hiding after getting death threats, but he'd managed to copy the ship's technical logs before running. He sent me readouts showing the stabilizers had been throwing critical failure warnings for 3 hours before we hit the storm, warnings that Torres had personally disabled so they wouldn't disturb the passengers during dinner service. The data showed Torres overriding 17 different safety protocols that night, each one time-stamped and logged with his captain's authorization code. I knew this evidence could change everything, but Victor said he couldn't testify because they'd already tried to run him off the road twice, and he had a family to protect. 6 months after the sinking, I finally worked up the courage to visit Sophia's parents in Arizona, bringing her compass and videos of our performances together on the ship. Her mother opened the door and just stared at me for the longest time before letting me in, and when I handed her the compass, she held it against her chest like it contained her daughter's soul. Those logs Torres wrote about his own skills while people were in danger. What was going through his mind that he thought writing those things down was a good idea? We sat in their living room watching videos of Sophia and me doing our magic act, her smile filling the screen while her parents cried quietly beside me. Her father finally spoke after an hour of silence, admitting he'd blamed me because he needed someone living to be angry at, someone he could actually yell at instead of the ocean that took his daughter. Her mother showed me Sophia's old room, still exactly how she'd left it before joining the cruise line, with magic books and practice props scattered everywhere. They asked me to tell them everything about her last day, every detail I could remember, and I spent 3 hours going through each moment from our morning coffee to the last time I saw her helping passengers. When I left, they gave me a photo of Sophia as a kid doing card tricks for her elementary school talent show, that same determined look on her face that she had when helping people escape the sinking ship. The documentary crew had been working for months and finally aired their first preview on national television, showing my testimony mixed with the security footage they'd recovered from the ship's black box. The cruise line filed an emergency injunction within hours, trying to block the full release, claiming defamation and damage to their reputation, but the judge who reviewed the footage denied their request. Their lawyers sent cease and desist letters to everyone involved, but the footage was already spreading online, showing Torres laughing at Mitchell's evacuation requests while water poured through the windows behind him. 6 months after losing Sophia, I found myself standing at the Miami port where our cruise had departed, watching another ship from the same line boarding hundreds of passengers. Families were taking photos at the gangway, excited for their vacation, completely unaware of what could happen if another captain decided his ego mattered more than their lives. I wanted to run up and grab them, scream warnings about checking the weather, demanding to know evacuation procedures, making sure their captain wasn't another Torres who'd rather die than admit he was wrong. But I knew they'd just think I was some crazy person, another traumatized survivor who couldn't move on, couldn't let go of the past. Security was already watching me from the terminal, probably warned about survivors showing up to cause scenes, so I just stood there watching people board while my hands shook. A little girl dropped her stuffed dolphin near me, and when I picked it up to hand it back, her mother pulled her away quickly like I was dangerous, like grief was contagious. Month 7 brought the start of the civil trial with the courthouse packed with reporters and survivors' families filling every available seat. Kim played the audio recording of Torres laughing at Mitchell's evacuation pleas during opening statements, while the cruise line's lawyers argued no captain could have predicted such an unprecedented storm. They painted Torres as a hero who went down with his ship, conveniently leaving out how he'd trapped himself on the bridge through his own arrogance. The cruise line's lawyer stood there saying Torres had followed standard protocol, that evacuating earlier would have caused unnecessary panic, that the storm was a freak occurrence nobody could have foreseen. Kim destroyed their argument by showing weather service warnings issued 6 hours before the sinking, warnings every other ship in the area had heeded by changing course or finding safe harbor. When my turn came to testify, I sat in that witness chair for 6 straight hours, describing every detail from Torres threatening to destroy my career to Sophia's final moments helping trapped passengers. The cruise line's lawyer kept interrupting, suggesting that Sophia and I had caused panic by triggering unauthorized evacuations, that we'd created chaos that led to more deaths. I lost it completely, standing up and screaming about corporate murder, about how they'd rather count money than bodies, how they were still sending ships out with the same safety problems. The judge called a recess and warned me about outbursts, but the jury had seen my raw emotion, the truth that no amount of legal maneuvering could hide. Mitchell took the stand next, producing maritime law documents proving he'd had full authority to relieve Torres of command if the captain was endangering the ship. He broke down crying when he admitted he'd hesitated because Torres had been his mentor for 15 years, that those extra minutes of hesitation had cost dozens of lives. The cruise line tried to paint him as a coward who'd abandoned his captain, but Mitchell had the receipts, showing he'd filed 17 safety complaints about Torres in the previous year, all ignored by corporate. He described trying physically to take the wheel while Torres fought him off, how security had initially backed Torres until the ship started tilting past 40 degrees. During a break in testimony, I sat with other survivors in the courthouse cafeteria, everyone sharing stories about the people they'd lost in whispered conversations over cold coffee. A mother described her son's last text, saying the captain had announced everything was fine, that he'd trusted authority right until water crashed through his cabin door and swept him away. An elderly man talked about his wife of 40 years who'd been trapped in an elevator when the power failed, how he could hear her screaming through the doors but couldn't get them open. A teenager showed us her father's final voicemail, telling her he loved her while you could hear glass breaking and water rushing in the background. We sat there sharing our grief like communion, understanding each other in ways the lawyers and reporters never could, bonded by a tragedy that should never have happened. Dr. Winters testified by video from Seattle because she couldn't handle being in the same room as the cruise line executives, describing the medical casualties that could have been prevented with earlier evacuation. She went through her list methodically, reading each name, their injuries, their last words, creating a record that made several jurors openly weep in their seats. She described performing CPR on children while the medical bay flooded, trying to move patients who were already dying from impact injuries when the ship listed, watching people drown in their beds because they couldn't be moved fast enough. The next day, the cruise line's CEO took the stand, looking like he'd practiced his sad face in the mirror for hours. He started talking about how shocked he was by the tragedy and how they'd never had any idea Torres had problems. But Kim stood up with a stack of papers that made the CEO's face go white. Kim walked over and started reading emails out loud where the CEO himself had approved Torres's last promotion, even though 3 different people had filed safety complaints about him. The email actually said Torres was a profit generator who keeps the shareholders happy, and the CEO had written back that a few complaints from jealous crew members shouldn't stop them from keeping their best captain. The CEO kept trying to explain, but Kim just kept pulling out more emails showing they'd known about Torres drinking on duty, about him ignoring weather warnings before, about him threatening crew members who questioned him. The judge called both lawyers to his chambers after lunch, and I watched them disappear behind the heavy wooden door while we all sat there waiting. An hour passed before they came back out, and the judge announced he'd reviewed the body camera footage from Security Chief Briggs and was ruling it admissible as evidence. The cruise line's lawyers looked sick as the judge explained the jury would see everything, including Torres hitting Mitchell and ordering crew to be tasered for trying to evacuate passengers. The next morning brought a surprise nobody expected when this guy in his 50s walked into court and took the witness stand. He introduced himself as Captain Robert Hayes, Torres's first officer from 5 years ago, and he'd broken his NDA to come testify. Hayes described how Torres would drink vodka from a water bottle during shifts and how he'd reported it 3 times before the cruise line fired him instead of Torres. They'd paid him $200,000 to sign papers saying he'd never talk about it, but he couldn't live with himself after hearing about all the people who died. Hayes pulled out photos he'd secretly taken of Torres passed out in his cabin during a shift, of empty bottles hidden behind navigation equipment, of incident reports that mysteriously disappeared from the ship's records. The cruise line's lawyers kept objecting, but the judge let him continue, and Hayes told us about the time Torres had almost hit another ship because he was too drunk to read the radar properly. 3 weeks passed before Kim called me one morning to say the jury was ready to watch Briggs's footage. I sat in that courtroom as they played the video on a huge screen, and you could hear people gasping when it showed Torres laughing about his perfect safety record while water poured through the bridge windows behind him. The worst part was when Torres hit Mitchell right in the face while Mitchell was begging him to let people evacuate, and then Torres turned to Briggs and ordered him to taser anyone who tried to launch lifeboats without permission. Several jury members were crying when the video showed Torres telling corporate everything was fine while you could hear people screaming for help in the background. The footage cut out when the bridge started flooding, but the last image was Torres still insisting nothing was wrong while the ship tilted so bad that furniture was sliding past him. Kim started his closing arguments the next week by putting up photos of every single person who died, 437 faces covering the entire wall of the court. courtroom. The way Captain Hayes broke his $200,000 NDA to show those hidden photos of Torres passed out drunk makes me wonder how many other captains are out there right now with similar problems being covered up by cruise companies. He walked through each decision Torres made, each warning he ignored, each crew member he threatened, showing how the cruise line knew exactly who Torres was and kept him as captain anyway because he made them money. He showed the emails again, the buried complaints, the NDAs they'd forced people to sign, the 3 safety inspectors they'd paid off to overlook violations. The defense lawyer got up and tried to argue that nobody could have predicted the storm would be that bad, that Torres had made the best decisions he could with the information available. He said the survivors were being manipulated by lawyers looking for a payday, that this was about money, not justice, that Torres had decades of experience and one bad night shouldn't define his whole career. He actually stood there and said the real tragedy was that a good company was being destroyed by people who wanted to profit from disaster. I went back to my apartment to wait while the jury deliberated, and every time my phone rang I thought it would be Kim with news. I taught card tricks to the kids next door just to keep my hands busy, showing them how to palm cards and do false shuffles while my phone sat silent on the table. 3 days went by with nothing, then 4, then 5, and I started wondering if maybe the cruise line's lawyers had been convincing enough to create doubt. That's when Sophia's mom called me out of nowhere, not about the trial, but just to talk. She told me she'd started a swimming program in Sophia's name, teaching kids from poor families how to swim so they'd never be helpless in the water like so many people were that night. She said whatever happened with the verdict, she wanted me to know that Sophia would be proud of me for fighting to tell the truth about what happened. The call came the next morning while I was making coffee, Kim's voice tight with excitement saying the jury was back. I threw on clothes and ran to the courthouse, getting there just as they were bringing everyone back into the courtroom. The foreman stood up holding a piece of paper, his hands shaking slightly as he read that they found the cruise line liable for gross negligence in the deaths of 437 passengers and crew. The damages came to $1.8 billion, and the foreman looked right at the cruise line's lawyers when he said their client's unconscionable corporate greed and systematic cover-up of Captain Torres's violations had directly caused one of the worst maritime disasters in modern history. Their lead lawyer jumped up before the judge even finished speaking and filed an appeal right there in the courtroom, his hands shaking as he claimed this award would destroy thousands of jobs and bankrupt the company. Kim stood up and told him they should have thought about that before they promoted a captain with 17 safety violations, before they covered up complaints, before they chose their schedule over people's lives. I walked out of the courthouse into the bright Miami sun and stood there holding Sophia's compass that I'd carried every single day since the rescue, and for the first time since watching that ship go down, I just broke. Dr. Winters had flown in from Seattle for the verdict, and she found me on the courthouse steps, sobbing harder than I'd ever cried in my life, not just for Sophia, but for everyone Torres killed with his ego. She held me while I fell apart completely, this woman who'd saved so many lives that night now saving me from drowning in my own grief. Over the next few weeks, the cruise line tried every legal trick to avoid paying, but then news broke that they'd filed for bankruptcy protection in month 11, trying to shield their assets from the judgment. The judge wasn't having any of it and froze all their accounts while ordering a complete audit, and the investigators found they'd been moving money to offshore accounts since the day after the sinking, knowing this was coming. I went back to that beach in Miami where I used to practice the bullet catch alone, but this time Mitchell was there, and Dr. Winters, and Lisa from Passenger Services, and dozens of other survivors who'd become my family. We held our own memorial service right there on the sand, everyone sharing one memory of someone we'd lost, creating this chorus of lives that mattered more than any corporate bottom line. The news channels started reporting that criminal charges were being filed against 3 cruise line executives for conspiracy and negligent homicide based on everything that came out in the civil trial, and they even charged Torres posthumously to make sure history recorded him as the killer he was, not some hero captain. When the 1-year anniversary came, they asked me to speak at the official memorial service at the port, and I stood in front of 500 people describing Sophia's last moments, helping strangers escape. I pulled out the engagement ring I'd bought the week before the cruise and showed it publicly for the first time, explaining how she died never knowing I was planning to propose after our final show, how she spent her last minutes saving lives instead of starting our life together. The documentary about the disaster premiered 2 weeks later with a dedication to Sophia and all the victims, using the footage I'd shot on my phone and testimony from the trial to show who these people really were beyond just names in a newspaper. The cruise line tried one last injunction to stop it from airing, but the public outcry was so intense they had to withdraw it within hours. Mitchell called me after the premiere to say he was writing a book about maritime reform and wanted to dedicate it to everyone who died because the industry put schedules over safety, and he asked if I'd write a chapter about Sophia to make sure her heroism was documented forever. I spent 3 days writing about the woman who taught me magic tricks were nothing compared to the magic of making someone smile, who never passed a crying child without stopping to help, who died the way she lived by putting others first. Dr. Winters and I went back to Miami Beach at sunset a month later to the exact spot where we'd first searched the survivor lists for Sophia's name, and she told me she was moving back from Seattle because she couldn't stay away from this community we'd built from tragedy. She'd found more purpose in our shared healing than in any hospital, and we stood there watching the sun sink into the same ocean that had taken so much from us, finding some kind of peace in being together. The FBI showed up at the cruise line's headquarters the next morning and arrested 2 executives right in front of their employees based on evidence of destroying documents and witness tampering that came out during the audit. The whole office erupted in applause as they were led out in handcuffs, these workers who'd lost friends and colleagues, finally seeing someone held accountable for decisions that killed people they loved. The bankruptcy court took 14 months to sort through the mess, and when the judge judge finally ruled, she made it clear that every single penny would go to victims and families before any corporate creditor saw a dime. The cruise line had to sell everything, including their headquarters building and 3 other ships still in service, watching their entire empire get picked apart piece by piece until nothing was left but a dead company name that nobody would ever use again. I used my settlement money to start the Sofia Rodriguez Maritime Safety Foundation with Mitchell's help, and we spent weeks meeting with senators and safety officials, pushing for new laws that would never let one person's ego override evacuation protocols again. Our first win came when Congress passed a law requiring 2 officers to agree on any decision that could risk passenger lives, something so basic it was insane. It hadn't existed before. Sofia's parents flew to Miami for the foundation launch, and I walked them through the old training facility where the cruise line used to run their safety drills, showing them the theater space we were converting into a classroom where future crew members would learn what really happened that night. Her mother touched the stage where Sofia had performed hundreds of shows and started crying, saying at least her daughter's death would save other people's children from drowning because some captain thought he knew better than everyone else. Lisa was teaching our first class of maritime trainees, standing in front of 30 young people who wanted to work on ships, telling them how regular crew members saved lives by breaking the rules when their captain went crazy. She showed them the actual override keys I'd stolen that night, now mounted in a display case with a plaque that said, "Moral courage matters more than following orders when people are dying." 2 months later, I finally felt ready to perform magic again, doing a show for the maritime students in that same converted theater where Sofia and I had practiced our routines. I did the bullet catch with a volunteer, explaining how the trick only works when you trust your partner completely, how that trust can mean life or death, whether you're on stage or trying to evacuate a sinking ship. The criminal trial started with Mitchell on the witness stand for 3 straight days, walking the jury through every email, every warning, every moment the executives ignored safety concerns to keep their profits flowing. The prosecutors played Briggs's security footage, showing the executives in meetings where they literally laughed about Torres being a loose cannon while deciding to keep him as captain because he ran the cheapest routes. Dr. Winters opened her trauma center specifically for people who'd survived disasters at sea, and she asked me to help design the space since I understood what survivors needed. We put in rooms with no ocean views for people who couldn't look at water yet, soundproofed walls so nobody would hear waves, and group therapy spaces where people could talk to others who actually understood what it felt like to choose between saving yourself and saving strangers. I'm fascinated by how Sofia's mom turned her grief into teaching poor kids to swim. What made her think of that specific way to honor her daughter? The cemetery built a memorial for everyone whose bodies were never found, this massive black granite wall with 200 names carved into it, and I finally went there with the engagement ring I'd bought for Sofia the week before we boarded that ship. I found her name near the middle of the wall and put the ring in this little alcove they'd built for people to leave things, knowing I had to let go of the future we'd planned together, even though part of me would always be trapped in those 20 minutes when I couldn't find her. The jury came back with guilty verdicts on every single count, and the judge gave those executives 15 to 20 years each for negligent homicide and conspiracy to endanger lives. She said that while Torres was the one who refused to evacuate, these men loaded the gun by keeping him in command when they knew he was dangerous, making them just as responsible for every person who drowned. 18 months after the sinking, I stood on the bridge of a brand new cruise ship as their safety consultant, teaching young officers about the night when one man's ego killed 400 people. I kept Sofia's compass in my pocket, the one thing of hers I'd managed to save, knowing that her sacrifice had led to new laws and training programs that would stop future captains from choosing their pride over passenger lives. Every ship now had to have automatic evacuation systems that would trigger if 2 officers agreed there was danger, and crew members were legally protected if they initiated evacuation against a captain's orders. The foundation had trained over 500 new maritime safety officers who understood that saving lives meant sometimes breaking rules, and we'd helped pass 7 new laws that stripped captains of absolute authority during emergencies. Standing on that bridge, watching those young officers take notes about emergency protocols, I realized Sofia had saved more lives by dying than we ever could have saved in a lifetime of magic shows, her heroism now written into maritime law that would protect passengers forever. Man, I'm honestly curious. What's it like having to teach about the worst night of your life every single day? Does talking about it actually help, or does it just keep the wound open? If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.